The first time many German soldiers heard the word Canadier, it rarely came from an intelligence report or a briefing from high command. Instead, it arrived as a quiet remark in a trench, a muttered warning passed along a frontline dugout, or a whispered conversation between exhausted men staring into the night. Within the vast machinery of the Wehrmacht, Canada was barely a political footnote, an auxiliary member of the British Empire with a small population and no grand military traditions. Yet on the battlefields of Europe, the reputation of the Canadian soldier spread not through propaganda, but through the raw, unfiltered experiences of those who faced them and survived. Imagine a damp bunker near Ortona in December 1943. A group of Fallschirmjäger huddled together, the cold creeping through their greatcoats. Outside, the church bells lay buried beneath rubble. The town had become a shattered maze of stone and dust. One paratrooper spat into the dirt and said almost casually, "Canadians coming." The others fell silent. No one laughed. That alone said everything. The Canadians, the Germans discovered, did not fight like the British. They were not as cautious, not as rigid, not as bound by textbook maneuvers. They did not fight like the Americans either, bold, energetic, sometimes reckless. Nor did they resemble the Soviets, whose strategy often relied on overwhelming numbers. The Canadians instead carried a strange mix of precision and brutality, discipline and unpredictability, like men who understood both the science and the chaos of war. To German intelligence officers, this contradiction was confounding. To frontline troops, it was terrifying. A report from the 1st Parachute Division described the Canadians as methodical to the point of relentlessness, noting that they did not break easily and did not panic even under heavy fire. Other accounts highlighted their accuracy with rifles, their uncanny ability to appear from unexpected angles, and their refusal to yield ground once taken. Rumors circulated that many Canadian infantrymen were former hunters, farmers, or woodsmen, men accustomed to harsh terrain, long marches, and handling weapons from boyhood. Whether true or embellished, the impression struck deep. By 1944, German units that had fought in both Italy and Normandy began comparing notes. The Canadians were described with quiet respect, sometimes tinged with dread. One Wehrmacht officer wrote, "They do not boast. They do not shout. They simply advance." Another remarked that the Canadians fought as if the mud, the ruins, and the cold belonged to them. Such testimonials rarely appeared in official German communiques, but they survived in diaries, letters, and post-war interviews, private spaces where soldiers told the truth without fear of censorship. This narrative begins with that truth: the Germans did not fear Canada as a nation, they feared the men they met on the battlefield. The story of how that unexpected respect formed begins long before Canadians proved themselves in Italy and Normandy. It starts with a dangerous assumption, one Germany would regret. Before the war truly tested them, German high command viewed the Canadians through a narrow and dismissive lens. To the strategists at OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Canada was merely an appendage of the British Empire, a distant dominion contributing raw materials, aircraft production, and a handful of divisions likely to be deployed under British command. In Berlin, few imagined that Canadian troops would earn a reputation separate from their Commonwealth partners. In the pre-war years, German analysts studied the British Army's colonial forces: Indians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, and Canadians. In their calculations, Canada ranked near the bottom in perceived importance. Intelligence summaries described a small peacetime army, limited mechanization, and a military heritage overshadowed by Britain's long history of imperial warfare. The Germans believed Canadian divisions would be well equipped because British supplies were reliable, but not particularly formidable. Part of this underestimation came from geography. Germany had always studied its continental rivals in meticulous detail. France, Poland, and Russia were immediate threats. Britain was a unique case, a naval giant and air power Germany admired but did not fully understand. Canada, by contrast, was too distant, too quiet, too politically stable to seem relevant. When war broke out in 1939, German officers expected Britain to rely heavily on its traditional professional regiments. They assumed Canadian involvement would arrive slowly, following the pattern of World War I, supportive, loyal, but strategically secondary. In the opening years of the conflict, there was nothing visible on the battlefield to contradict that assumption. Yet small cracks in German confidence appeared early. The Canadians deployed rapidly, faster than the Germans predicted. Their units trained intensively in Britain, adapted well to modern weapons, and their officers emphasized initiative at the platoon and company levels, qualities the Wehrmacht itself prized highly. Still, German intelligence dismissed these signs as enthusiasm rather than capability. Everything changed in August 1942. The Dieppe raid was a disaster for the Canadians, but it shocked the Germans in a wholly unexpected way. What Berlin saw as a failed assault, frontline troops saw as a brutal demonstration of something far more dangerous: the Canadians' unwavering willingness to press the attack even when the cost was catastrophic. Germans fighting in bunkers and on cliffs remembered not a disorganized invasion, but an enemy that kept coming despite machine gun fire, mines, broken landing craft, and hopeless odds. One German soldier wrote, "They attacked even when there was no path forward. They fought hand to hand on the stones. They did not stop." This was neither the careful, methodical British infantry the Wehrmacht expected, nor the improvisational, aggressive American style. For the first time, a seed was planted in German commanders' minds: the Canadians might be something else entirely. By late 1942, German field reports began referring to Canadian units more frequently. The tone shifted. Observers noted their discipline, marksmanship, and ability to maintain cohesion even in chaos. At Dieppe, the Canadians had failed their objective, but in doing so, they had introduced themselves to the Wehrmacht with unforgettable force. Canada, once a footnote, had now entered German consciousness. The full story of that transformation would unfold in the ruins of Italian cities and the hedgerows of Normandy, where German soldiers would learn, often painfully, that their early assumptions had been dangerously wrong. The grey dawn that rose over Dieppe on August 19, 1942, was a day neither Germans nor Canadians would ever forget. To the world, the raid would be recorded as a catastrophic failure. More than half of the Canadian troops who landed were killed, wounded, or captured. But for the Germans who stood on those pebble beaches, manned those machine gun nests, and fought room to room in the seaside town, the memory was not of a triumphant defense, it was of shock. Before Dieppe, German troops had various expectations about their Allied opponents. The British were professional, but cautious. The French, defeated early, were scarcely considered. The Americans had not yet fully entered the European battlefield. As for the Canadians, few German soldiers had fought them directly since World War I, and most knew nothing of them beyond vague mentions in British newspapers. But at Dieppe, German defenders witnessed something both terrifying and strangely admirable. Canadian infantrymen advancing through impossible conditions, refusing to break even as the sea turned red around them. German machine gunners recalled how the Canadians continued to run across open beaches long after the first waves had been cut down. Officers noted how platoon reorganized themselves under fire, how men dragged wounded comrades behind shattered landing craft, how some squads fought to the last bullet in front of the casino. One German account described a group of Canadians who, after their officers were killed, continued to assault a fortified gun position with nothing but grenades and bayonets, crawling over bodies, smoke, and broken concrete. They succeeded in silencing the nest for a few minutes until German reserves counterattacked. Another diary entry, written by a Wehrmacht private, reads, "They did not retreat. They simply fell where they stood." This was not the reckless courage of green troops who did not understand what awaited them. These were trained, disciplined soldiers who fought with a grim determination that German officers had not expected from a nation they considered militarily secondary. Ironically, the German defenders at Dieppe admired the Canadians more because the raid failed, not despite it. The willingness to push forward through machine gun fire, snipers, interlocking fields of fire, barbed wire, and exposed beach approaches impressed even the hardened coastal defenders of the 302nd Infantry Division. In the aftermath, German intelligence began to adjust its assessment. Reports noted that the Canadians exhibited unusual aggressiveness, notable resilience under fire, and a capacity for disciplined initiative. While the raid achieved none of its intended objectives, it achieved something entirely It introduced the Canadians to the German army, not as background Commonwealth troops, but as shock infantry with a distinctive and troubling tenacity. That memory followed the Germans long after the beaches were cleared, when Canadian units later appeared in Sicily, in the mountains of Italy, and eventually in Normandy. German soldiers who had been at DEP recognized the maple leaf badges on their captive sleeves. They remembered the bodies lying in the surf. They remembered the cold determination in their eyes. From that day forward, no German soldier who had fought at DEP ever underestimated a Canadian again. Italy was where the Germans truly learned what it meant to fight the Canadians. The landing in Sicily had shown that the Canadians moved quickly, adapted fast, and handled rough terrain better than most Allied units. But it was in the blood-soaked streets of Ortona, the ridges of the Moro River, and the shattered houses along the Adriatic coast that the Canadian legend, at least in German eyes, was forged. By late 1943, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division faced the elite German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, arguably one of the most respected and deadly formations in the entire Wehrmacht. These were not ordinary infantry. They were Goering's pride. Veterans hardened in Cree, North Africa, and Monte Cassino. They were masters of defense, urban combat, and delaying actions. And yet, as the Canadians approached Ortona, the paratroopers began to speak of their new opponents with wary respect. The Germans had fought the British. They had fought the Americans. They had fought nearly every major military force in Europe. But the Canadians moved differently. They advanced in small, tightly coordinated groups, covering one another with precise rifle fire. They adapted quickly to the environment. They were aggressive, but not reckless. When they met a wall of resistance, they did not pull back. They swarmed around it. Ortona became their masterpiece, though masterpiece seems too elegant for a battle fought inch by inch through rubble, dust, and blood. The Germans were shocked by a tactic they had never seen used so effectively: mouse hauling. Canadian infantry blasted holes through the walls of adjoining buildings to bypass machine gun positions, snipers, and booby-trapped doorways. Instead of moving through the streets where the Fallschirmjäger had set deadly kill zones, the Canadians tunneled through the town like urban miners. German defenders found themselves attacked from the side, from above, from behind. A house they believed secure would suddenly erupt into gunfire as a Canadian section burst through a blasted wall. The Fallschirmjäger reported that the Canadians fought with a creativity and boldness rarely seen among Allied ground forces. One German paratrooper later said, "They turned the city into a warren and hunted us like ghosts." Although the Germans eventually withdrew from Ortona, the impression the Canadians left behind burned itself into their memory. The Fallschirmjäger were not men who easily praised their enemies. Yet, several post-war interviews mentioned the Canadians specifically as some of the toughest opponents they faced in the entire Italian campaign. Beyond Ortona, Canadian troops continued to claw their way through Italy's brutal terrain: mountains, ravines, vineyards, olive groves, mud-choked riverbanks. Germany's defensive lines were designed to bleed attackers dry. Yet the Canadians advanced steadily, often at terrible cost, but with the same calculated determination that had surprised the Germans at DEP. A German officer captured in 1944 described the Canadians as stormtroops in the mold of our own, a rare compliment from an army that seldom acknowledged Allied infantry as equals. Italy taught the Germans that DEP had not been a fluke. The Canadians were not merely brave. They were methodical, adaptive, disciplined, and relentless. When the Wehrmacht saw Canadian formations appear again in 1944, this time in Normandy, many German veterans of Italy warned their younger comrades. These are not British. These are Canadians. Treat them with care. Their reputation was no longer whispered. It was established. The beaches of Normandy were only the beginning. The Germans who fought the Canadians in the summer of 1944 did not fear the initial landings. They feared what came afterward. The Bocage country, with its ancient hedgerows, sunken lanes, and blind corners, was the perfect defensive environment for the Wehrmacht. For weeks, they had pushed back the British and stalled the Americans. But then the Canadians entered the battlefield and the Germans began to speak of them in the same tone they reserved for the toughest Soviet Guards divisions. Karpik Airfield became the first major encounter. The SS Hitler-Jugend division, composed of young but fanatical soldiers, trained with uncompromising brutality, expected to crush the Canadians quickly. Their commanders believed discipline and ideology would triumph over any Commonwealth force. Yet, as hours passed and bodies piled, the SS realized they were facing something entirely different. The Canadians advanced through withering fire, halting only long enough to regroup before moving again. Their artillery coordination struck the Germans as unervingly precise. Every time the SS tried to organize a counterattack, Canadian mortars and field guns shattered the formation before it fully formed. One German officer complained bitterly in a captured report. "They lock onto our positions with unnatural quickness." The Canadians' combination of armor, infantry, and supporting fire was not elegant, but it was effective. German accounts describe an enemy that fought like a hammer, heavy, deliberate, and crushing. Unlike the British, who often paused to consolidate, or the Americans, who pushed aggressively forward without pausing to refine their approach, the Canadians mixed caution with aggression in a way the Wehrmacht found uniquely difficult to counter. The battle for Caen deepened this impression. German defenders described the Canadians as stubborn in the most literal, almost geological sense. Advance a few hundred meters, get pushed back, and return again the next day with the same grim persistence. The Canadians did not retreat in the same way other Allied units might. When forced to pull back by heavy fire, they did so only far enough to avoid annihilation. Then they dug in, reorganized, and resumed the assault as soon as artillery had prepared the ground. One SS veteran recalled with disbelief how the Canadians kept coming. "They fight us as if they have already counted the cost and accepted it." There was something almost unnerving about their determination. German snipers noted that Canadian infantrymen moved through hedge with the alert posture of hunters, not conscripts. Marksmen among the Canadians, many of whom had grown up shooting in the vast Canadian outdoors, displayed deadly accuracy with their Lee Enfield No. 4 rifles. German patrols learned quickly to avoid silhouetting themselves on ridge lines or exposed paths. Canadian sharpshooters would punish such mistakes immediately. And then came files. Trapped in the shrinking pocket, thousands of German soldiers tried desperately to escape the tightening Allied noose. The Canadians formed one of the northern jaws of that trap. German officers later wrote that the Canadians' fire discipline, their defensive positions, and their willingness to hold under extreme pressure made escape nearly impossible. Canadian tanks, anti-tank teams, infantry, snipers, and artillery all worked with a unity that caught retreating German units off guard. Those who survived the files pocket carried the memory with them. It was not anger they felt toward the Canadians. It was a sober acknowledgement. In the chaos, smoke, and desperation of the retreat, the Germans had seen exactly what the Canadians were capable of when fighting on the offensive and the defensive alike. Normandy was the moment when the Canadians' reputation stopped being anecdotal. Across the German army, from SS Panzer to beaten remnants of infantry divisions, everyone understood the Canadians were soldiers to be respected, avoided when possible, and confronted only with overwhelming force. If Normandy taught the Germans to respect the Canadians, the Scheldt taught them to fear them. The Scheldt estuary was not a battlefield any army wanted. It was a hellscape of tidal flats, flooded fields, dikes, mud, and choking cold winds. Traditional tactics meant nothing there. Tanks bogged down. Artillery sank. Machine gun nests became islands in a shifting sea of muck. German commanders believed the terrain itself was their greatest ally. They were certain that whoever tried to cross it would drown, starve, or break. Then the Canadians arrived. The Germans had thought Ortona's rubble was the pinnacle of misery. They were wrong. The Scheldt turned the Canadian advance into something primal, almost mythic. Battalions waded through waist-deep mud that swallowed boots and equipment. Rain turned trenches into brown canals. Every movement was slow, exhausting, and visible to German gunners positioned on dikes and high ground. But what stunned the Germans was not the terrain. It was the Canadians' refusal to stop. Wehrmacht soldiers watching through binoculars wrote that the Canadians moved through the flooded killing fields as if the mud belonged to them. They carried rifles over their heads, pushed makeshift rafts with supplies, and dragged anti-tank guns across sodden ground with ropes tied around their waists. Any other Allied force would have withdrawn to regroup. The Canadians simply kept advancing. A German officer on Walcheren Island later wrote, "I do not understand how they had the strength to continue. Every step was suffering." The Canadians fought like men who had accepted the environment's cruelty as part of the mission. They hugged the dikes, crawled through reeds, moved in small squads across open water during low tide, and attacked at angles the Germans had not anticipated. Canadian engineers worked miracles, building floating bridges, patching dikes, and improvising solutions that left the Germans bewildered. What disturbed the German defenders most was the Canadians' composure. Even when soaked, shivering, exhausted, and caked in mud, they coordinated assaults with precision. Artillery observers, perched on precarious positions, called fire with deadly accuracy. Snipers used tufts of grass, puddles, and reeds as cover, picking off German officers and radio men. German troops described the Canadians as shadow figures emerging from the water, a haunting image repeated in multiple post-war testimonies. The Scheldt became a psychological defeat as much as a tactical one. German units that had once prided themselves on standing firm began showing signs of unease. Their defensive lines were strong, but their spirit eroded as they realized the Canadians were willing to suffer more, endure more, and push deeper into the mud than any opponents they had faced in the West. When the final German positions on Walcheren fell, captured German paratroopers expressed genuine bewilderment. They had assumed the terrain would break the Canadians before any rifle or MG-42 ever could. But the Canadians had done what the Germans thought impossible. By winter 1944, the Wehrmacht had a new term for the Maple Leaf Troops: Lammkrieger, the Mud Warriors. It was not an insult. It was a warning. Long before the war ended, the Germans had begun documenting their grudging respect for Canadian troops. These were not public declarations meant to boost morale or shape propaganda. They were internal assessments, field intelligence reports, diary entries, post-action analyses intended only for senior officers. In these private spaces, where honesty mattered more than ideology, a clear portrait emerged. German analysts consistently noted the Canadians' discipline. Unlike many Allied formations that varied widely in quality, most Canadian battalions displayed a steady professional cohesion that reminded some Wehrmacht officers of their own best units. They rarely broke formation under pressure. They maintained control in Chaos, and they recovered quickly from shock, something German tacticians valued above every other battlefield trait. But the Germans noticed something even more unsettling: the Canadians' marksmanship. Throughout the Italian and Northwest European campaigns, German commanders commented on the unusually accurate Canadian rifle and Bren gunfire. After-action reviews mentioned that Canadian small arms fire created the impression of heavier numbers than actually present. This was not an accident. Many Canadian soldiers had grown up hunting or shooting recreationally. Aiming well was not a skill learned at a training depot. It was a childhood habit. The sniper reports troubled the Germans even more. Canadian snipers, especially those from rural provinces and indigenous communities, built reputations that bordered on legendary. German patrol leaders near the Adriatic coast once wrote that anyone who exposed a helmet for more than 3 seconds risked losing it. In Normandy, German mortar crews learned to change positions, frequently because Canadian sharpshooters could shoot through slit trenches with alarming precision. In one SS account, a young officer described advancing cautiously along a hedgerow only to see his radio man fall without warning. The shot had come from so far away that no one heard the crack. The Canadians were invisible but ever present, a phenomenon that German infantry began calling the silent net. The Germans were also baffled by how well the Canadians coordinated their fire support. Their artillery especially earned praise. Controlled, ruthless, and mathematically precise. The Germans later learned why Canadian units practiced fire plans obsessively. They synchronized watches to the second. They calculated wind, terrain, and enemy movement with a level of rigor typically associated with German gunnery. One captured German colonel admitted that Canadian artillery moved like a creeping shadow, always just ahead of their infantry. He added that this made them exceptionally hard to stop because the Canadian advance never outran its own protection. What truly struck German observers, however, was something more intangible. Canadian troops displayed a quiet professionalism that unnerved the Wehrmacht. They did not shout battle cries. They did not rush into situations impulsively. Their officers rarely engaged in flamboyant displays of leadership. The Canadians advanced like men performing a difficult but familiar job. Steady, determined, and unafraid of hardship. A senior German officer captured near Groningen summarized it perfectly. They are not loud soldiers. They are effective soldiers. As the war dragged on and as Canadian divisions defeated German defenders in terrain ranging from mountain towns to swampy river deltas, the tone of German intelligence shifted from condescension to genuine concern. The Canadians had become one of the few Allied forces the Germans consistently respected and frequently feared. When the war finally ended and surviving German officers were interrogated by Allied intelligence teams, they spoke more freely than ever. With the Reich collapsed, the SS discredited, and the Wehrmacht shattered beyond recognition, there was no longer any need to maintain illusions or bolster myths of invincibility. Their comments about Canadian troops were not flattery. They were blunt, often reluctant, but unmistakably sincere. German officers consistently used 3 words to describe the Canadians. The first was tenacious. German commanders observed that Canadian infantry rarely abandoned an attack once it commenced. Even when pinned down, they held their ground with a stubbornness that reminded the Germans of their own elite mountain divisions. Once Canadian troops gained a foothold, dislodging them demanded disproportionate effort. They fought like men who did not comprehend the meaning of surrender. Their approach was methodical. The Canadians engaged in combat like skilled craftsmen. Their assaults were meticulously planned, their movements synchronized, and their communication systems efficient. They employed fire and maneuver with the precision of a well-drilled unit, yet retained sufficient flexibility to exploit sudden opportunities. German field officers noted that the Canadians had achieved a rare balance between discipline and initiative. Accuracy was paramount, and the Canadians delivered it consistently. Their rifle fire, artillery strikes, and sniper shots were remarkably effective. Their engineers accomplished feats under pressure. Their logistical networks functioned smoothly even in the harshest terrain. In the Wehrmacht's clinical language, precision equaled lethality, and the Canadians had it in abundance. Yet beyond these tangible qualities, the Germans also respected the Canadians for reasons that were harder to articulate. Canadian units carried no pre-war mythos like the Gurkhas or the French Foreign Legion. They had no ideological fanaticism akin to the SS. They lacked the industrial capacity of the Americans and the centuries-old military aristocracy of the British. Their strength did not derive from propaganda, technology, or sheer numbers, it came from their identity. Many Germans observed that Canadian soldiers seemed unusually comfortable with adversity. Whether facing mud, cold, hunger, or exhaustion, they endured with a quiet resilience that struck the Germans as fundamentally different from other Western Allied troops. Some attributed it to Canada's rugged landscapes. Others remarked on their sense of humor, even under fire, dark, sharp, and oddly calming. A few suggested that the Canadians fought not for conquest or revenge, but because they believed it was just. Perhaps that belief rendered them harder to intimidate. In the final months of the war, as German morale faltered and desertions increased, the Canadians remained composed and relentless. They liberated towns with care and discipline, treated prisoners humanely, and refused to be carried away by triumph or hatred. The contrast left a lasting impression on many German soldiers. One veteran reflected years later, "If I had to face any Allied soldier again, I would hope it was not the Canadian. They were the fairest and the most dangerous." With that judgment, the story becomes unmistakably clear: the Germans did not fear Canada as a nation, they feared the character of the men who fought under its flag. Across the rubble of Ortona, the hedgerows of Normandy, and the frozen waters of the Scheldt, the Canadians earned respect the hard way, through grit, discipline, precision, and an unshakable determination that even the Wehrmacht could not ignore. When the war ended and the world counted its heroes, the Germans knew one truth above all: the Canadians were not merely competent soldiers, they were among the finest they had ever faced.